You are listening to the Mary Jane Society podcast, where you will meet entrepreneurs, cultivators, scientists, doctors, and inventors in the cannabis industry.
Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Pam Schmiel. When we talk about crafting the best cannabis products, we often focus on extraction and preserving key compounds. But what happens in the curing process is just as crucial, if not more, when it comes to manipulating and enhancing a strain's unique characteristics. Joe Edwards knows a lot about this and has engineered decontamination and curing technology for Yofumo, where he's the chief science officer. He's a biochemist, engineer, and expert on various agricultural systems and operations. And he's won multiple awards for his post-harvest curation methodologies. Join us as we geek out and get deep into the weeds of curing. Let's welcome Joe Edwards.
I thought we could just start with, what is your background and what is Yofumo? Just a little brief start, and then we'll jump into all the questions.
Absolutely. As you know, Joseph Edwards, I'm a biochemist, I'm an engineer. I've been actively involved in the cannabis community since Colorado went live in medical. Oh man, how long is that ago now? 2009. So been
Wow.
an active member, not only through the development of the infrastructure of the cannabis industry through Colorado, through other states as they've begun onboarding, but I've really started to take a look at the regulatory landscape, how that's really developed in terms of microbial regulation and compliance, how we really begin to look at product education, product development from a consumer standpoint, and then kind of bringing that all back around into IP development within the sector. So I've been doing this now for, oh man, that's did the math in my head. Wow, almost 17 years in now or so. That's great. Oof, all right. Made myself feel old. Anyway.
You Colorado people and California people, that's why it's good to check in, that's why you guys are all really important, because you've really have a lot of water under the bridge,
Well, it's been an amazing industry to be a part of in so many ways. I mean, you have the birth of a truly new agrarian commodity-based industry, and despite the federal illegality, because we have such kind of microclimates of individual state regulation, we've really gotten to preserve in some ways some of those uniquities that each state was really known for, some of those key strains, some of those key development technologies, cultivation methodologies, extraction methodologies, and going into curation and post-harvest methodologies that have a lot of history to them, some more science-driven, some more art-driven than others, but kind of that denomination of origin, not only of cultivars and strains, but also techniques and methodologies. So it's been a really cool industry to kind of see grow up in those microcosms and then now come together in kind of a really academic style environment. So really interested to see what comes next and how we go forward.
Yeah, I know. It seems like we have a wide open road. So tell us about Yofumo.
So Fumo Technologies, at heart, we're a decontamination company. It's principally what we foster is bioremediation, state compliance testing, which is a huge issue across the industry, especially with the wide range and plethora of microbial standards the states are being held to. We have communities like Oregon, which have rebelled against testing standards for good reason. It very much invalidated a large portion of the cultivation methodologies that were being practiced in the state. There was a lot of living soil operations in Oregon that really were producing some incredibly fine cannabis, but just based on the methodology of testing and the testing battery for the microbial compounds that the state was looking at, it nearly crippled the industry from a cultivation standpoint, as a lot of those methodologies go out the door. Unfortunately, the way state testing works in pretty much unilaterally throughout the US is we're not really looking at pro-enzymatic or probiotic bacteria or enzymes. We're looking at the total content. And a lot of times cultivation methodologies that utilize compound teas, foiler sprays, worm castings, more traditional based methodologies or living soil methodologies have a much higher susceptibility to failing those tests because they utilize those pro-enzymatic and probiotic bacteria because they want to stimulate greater chemical involved organic compound production. So it's kind of been a real trouble there as the industry really regulates and looks at how is it going to tackle the remediation question, how is it going to tackle the microbial compliance question. And that's one of the things that Yofumo was born out of, is how can we design a product that is completely non-invasive to the plant, that's not damaging the volatile organic compounds, the cannabinoids, the terpenes, the flavonoids that we really want to develop, preserve, and offer to our growing community and our consumers, but while simultaneously meeting those incredibly stringent standards, far more stringent than most of the food safety standards that we look at for fruits, vegetables, grains. When you compare the two, cannabis is held to a far more rigorous protocol. And there's some merit behind that as well, especially when we start looking at it as a medicinal product or an individual or nutraceutical product. There is merit there. But because of that, it can be very difficult to cultivate cannabis effectively. And as the market shrinks, as we see more MSOs kind of take over some of the mom and pop shops that were, frankly, in my opinion, some of the greatest producers of cannabis, we have a tightening in margins as well as a tightening in microbial standards. So now we have this demand from almost an industry-wide cultivator perspective where all of the product has to come to market. How can we get that product to market effectively? Yes, some product is needed for extraction and other ancillary product production, but when you really look at what you want to bring to market, a lot of these cultivators still want to bring the totality of that flower. And then when you then compound that with the idea that in order to bring that high-end flower to market, you really need to differentiate yourself in the market. So now we're looking at properly dried, properly cured cannabis that is not just pushed out the door for as cheap as it can possibly be, but cannabis that has been developed to its nth capability and is being produced as effectively as possible. So now the revolutionizing of our industry, kind of coming from that light agrarian to full indoor systemized agricultural farming, is really where Yofumo's tried to position itself by, again, providing that platform for decontamination and then a secondary platform from that curation and development.
So are you saying that Oregon is right, even though you find merit in strict regulations on what microbes and
I think that Oregon provides a unique case sample in the sense that one of the microbial compounds that we're failing for predominantly was Aspergillus niger, black mold. They also had a high occurrence of Aspergillus terreus, flavus, fumigatus across the entire end. These are pathogenic compounds. They have a notable negative impact on the human condition. There is no reason whatsoever to allow for that to be present in cannabis, to be able to go from an inhalated product and potentially develop aspergillosis in a patient, client, or consumer. By no means whatsoever. What I do think is an interesting idea is that an industry that was predicated on a very niche methodology and some kind of very traditional methodologies there that had a long history of cultivation was so out of tune with the regulatory body that was representing it that there became a disconnect there. And now we're seeing a delay in that microbial regulation. Do I think that there should be regulations around aspergillus? Oh my God, yes, it can be a potentially very dangerous compound. Do I think that cultivation methodologies in the industry, especially in these microcosms, these little regulations before we see a federal legalization, need to be very much in tune and in step with the people, with the cultivators, the people laws are affecting? Absolutely. I'm eager to see what Oregon again puts back out, but we see things on the similar end of the spectrum on the other side. If you look at New York's initially proposed set of regulations, it was so horribly disclusive to almost everything that the idea of cultivating anything under that regulatory landscape was nigh on impossible. I can't remember the totality of the list, but it was dozens and dozens of specifically named microbial compounds, bacteria and enzymes that had not been identified by any other state test. And then you have what becomes the burden on the operator again in the form of the testing. The idea that you would have to test for the whole battery that New York was initially proposing would have made tests so horribly expensive that the idea of failing one would have either led to cheating of the test, alternate solutions, or potentially stifled the industry. So there's absolutely a balance to be had there. And I think some states have found a better balance than others. We'll look at Chicago, for example. Chicago has one of the tightest microbial compliance statutes in the country. They have one of these smaller producing industries, but the individuals producing there are managing to adhere to it. Are they going through decontamination of near the totality of their product, be it by a Yofumo-like system or a rat source-like system? Yeah, so they absolutely are, but you can still work within those guide rails and just kind of trying to find that balance thereof. And I think that's really where the industry is currently suffering. And then when you pair that with the idea that there is no standardization on how we're doing this analytical methodology, we may be looking at a microbial evaluation done based on plate-based methodologies, which is a 3M agar plate that's been allowed to incubate for, depending on the regulation, 48 to 72 hours. Once that plate is incubated, they'll take the plate, they'll take a piece of what's called thin film, it's spotted, and the spotting on that film constitutes X percentage, typically about 10%, sometimes lower, and they'll lay that film over the petri dish. Now, where those spots appear, they'll count everything under it, and they'll multiply that by whatever the total dividend was. So if it was 10%, they'll multiply it by 10. Now, that little red spot or that dissolution of red spots, that may fall on a colony, that may fall on a bed of colonies, that may fall in a complete blank space. So we have a huge variance there. We've now seen some laboratories bringing in PCRI and PCRQ technologies, thermocyclers, which are able to speed up this process. However, there's a large range of different chemical assays that these thermocyclers function off of, be it medicinal genomics, be it bioMérieux, and there's dozens of others that all have their own uniquities, that all test for different contaminants, different pathogens, different ranges of yeast and molds. So we have a lot of inconsistency both in our testing and we have a lot of inconsistency in our regulation. And with that in mind, one of the things that we really saw lacking was how can we present a technology that looks at all of this simultaneously? If you kind of rewind the clock a little bit, we start talking again about that birth of the industry in 2009 for med, 2014 for rec, we started looking at those Gen 1, Gen 2 facilities. There was not a lot of biosecurity being put into the build outs. We're looking at some wooden construction. We're looking at repurposing of older buildings, mechanic shops, old warehouses, old industrial buildings, all that have inherent flaws, all that have maybe natural contaminations in them. So now we're overlaying again, we're compounding this problem. And we weren't necessarily looking at proper personal protective gear. We weren't necessarily looking at proper sanitization SOPs. So now we were compounding the problem again, compounding the problem again. So with all that in mind and knowing that we were putting an awesome amount of development into front-end technologies for the plant pre-harvest, going from HVAC systems that were built for server farms to purpose-built HVAC systems, going from lighting systems that were built for the cut flower industry, which while similar is still incredibly different, to purpose-based, purpose spectrum lighting systems. But then we're getting to the end of the cultivation stage and we're going to harvest. And we're going right back into the Stone Age. We're going right back into agrarian methodologies that haven't been used outside of some third world countries in hundreds of years. We're going from a purpose-built, airtight cultivation room with proper airflow, a proper HVAC environment, proper temperature and humidity control, lighting spectrum, to a closet with a Home Depot dehumidifier, to a bucket, to a bin, to shaking something, to a very subjective methodology instead of the objective science that we were just using. So as we started to look at how can we solve that issue of contamination, no matter how wide range it was, how can we solve that issue of post-harvest consistency, that's really where Fumo took birth. And one of them very much leading to the other. In order to have a product that we could cure, that we could develop, that we could look at specific volatile organic compound development of, we first had to have a clean starting base. And we had to have a clean starting base no matter where we interacted with cannabis. So that allowed us, spurred us, I should say, to develop one of the most wide-range and extensively usable decontamination options for the industry. And then because we come from a very cultivator-forward background, it's also one of the highest throughput and cheapest in the industry. But kind of from there, a lot of cool things can happen. Once we have clean cannabis, then we can really start building on all the other awesome things that the industry has to offer.
So there's no other sector that could have been applied to the cannabis industry. Like, hemp, I know limited, but didn't they have like a system for because you're talking about like the greenhouses and the contamination within the greenhouses, or I guess outdoor
So,
grow, that's the worst.
so cannabis has some uniquities around it in the sense that because of its federal status as a Schedule One drug, there's been a near total lack of peer-reviewed scientific grade research on the plant, at least within the US. There are some studies throughout the US that have popped up over the years. There's some Canadian studies. There's a few out of Europe. There's a couple out of Africa. There's a few hemp studies out of Russia and China. They do exist, but there is by no means the cornucopia of research. Then we look at something like hops, we look at something like tobacco, even though we look at something like opiates and poppies for opium productions, like for poppies for opium production. We have a wide range and breadth of research on this. But with cannabis, we simply did not. It's, to use a term, lightly in jest, it's a deal with the devil, so to speak. We really, really wanted to prove that there was merit in cannabis, that it was not the Schedule One demon that it was kind of touted to be, but that it did have merit not only to the individual as a consumer, but also medicinally. And because of that, there was some concessions made, I think, initially around some of that microbial compliance. But to give you kind of an analog to it, you would be looking at a controlled medical compound production. So, and when you look at that, you look at GACP and GMP development pathways. At that point in time, and they do exist now throughout the US and through the world, up until probably 2022, I wouldn't have, with full confidence, told you that there was GMP, GACP operations that were actually functioning. Now there absolutely are. But because of that run-up pathway, because these operations, again, these Gen 1, Gen 2 facilities, a lot of them being repurposed businesses, a lot of being constructed out of inappropriate or inferior materials, and then just simply not having the developed SOPs as an industry. When cannabis kind of came online, there was a lot of kind of crossover. There's a lot of people from cut flower. There was a lot of horticulturalists, arborists. There was anybody that had come from an agrarian background, be it big ag or other, dip their toe in to a degree if they wanted to. And so there was a lot of competing ideas for how to do things, but with no regulatory requirement around them, there was never a call for it. Now we've seen that increase in regulatory call, that increase in compliance. Now there is, and a lot of these companies that were never built around it, never built these systems in, never developed it, are either finding them very difficult to subsist in the industry, or they're folding altogether. And there's a degree of sadness to that as well. Just because that company was maybe out of regulatory compliance for microbial safety, which absolutely they should be in. There's a lot of really cool cultivars. There's some really cool technologies. There's some really cool kind of personal concepts or kind of pet projects that have really fallen by the side, kind of by the wayside. But conversely, on the other side of the coin, we're inventing new cultivars, we're breeding constantly. New things hit the market every single day, to the point where seed trading has become like baseball cards were in the 80s, which is a really cool thing to see.
Yeah, that's true. Especially in Europe, like for Cannabis, that's where they all go to trade
Yep.
their seeds. Yeah.
I haven't been to Cannabis in many years, but it was a sight to behold.
Yeah, it was a sight to behold. Yes, I went last year for the first time. It was definitely, yes, very interesting. So just kind of winding down on the contamination end. So is the industry, trying to go towards like living soil, organic farming? Is that also presenting a problem? Like we're trying to adjust to better, farming conditions, more organic, and that's causing a problem in the contamination world as well. Because without,
It absolutely can, but I would say the industry at the whole, especially from an MSO perspective, is going for standardization. Can we repeat the exact same process with the exact same cultivar, both in terms of compound development, yield development, waste ratio, cost? That's what companies are going for. And to do that, they're going for the most stable mediums. A large portion of cannabis is grown in some version of coco noir, organic cocoa husk material that is treated to a varying degree of salt conductivity, washed, sanitized, and rinsed to be completely inert, and then disposed of after usage. There is some wastefulness in that, in the sense that, yes, you are disposing of soil that has an enzyme bed that has a high, probably at that point, a high threshold of probiotic, proenzymatic bacteria. But again, we're also operating in an industry that doesn't look at that separate from pathogenic bacteria. So in order to prevent that issue, in order to have that consistency, there is a little bit of waste where you could have some repetition. But sustainable farming practices are the new norm in cannabis. And it's because everybody is in a race to maintain that price per pound and that, that value of their agrarian product. It's a commodity at heart. And one of the things that we've seen is that as states continue to develop their cannabis industries, we do see pretty much the continual decline of the value of cannabis. I want to say that the value of cannabis in Colorado right now is sitting somewhere around 700 to 1,200
Oh,
a pound. There was a point in time 5, 6 years ago where there was 3x that number. As the industry stabilizes, we see, a kind of a meet of demand, supply and demand. That price elasticity does find its median point, and that's a good thing. I'm sure the cultivators in every state were incredibly happy when weed was inordinately high, but it's one of those things that doesn't maintain itself. So being able to plan for that, being able to understand that at the end of the day, you're going to have to find a way to grow it as efficiently as possible and bring all of it to market is really what that sustainable practice is. And part of that sustaining is, again, remediation at this point.
yeah, right. So basically, so does everybody have to, I mean, pretty much should be remediating like that?
If you don't have a product that needs it, then you don't have a product that needs it. It is absolutely possible to cultivate cannabis without the need for remediation. It is 100% viable. There are hundreds of companies that do it every single day, and they do it incredibly well. Now, doing it 100% of the time for 100% of the lifespan of a business, are there some that have done it? Yes. Is that exceedingly rare? Yeah, it is.
Yeah, yeah.
Here's what happens realistically. Cultivars are like people. We all know someone who doesn't get sick. We all know someone who never seems to get healthy. Cultivars can have that same thing. We can have cultivars of varying degrees of susceptibility. We can also have weird spots within rooms, hot spots, cold spots, wet spots, dry spots. Hey, maybe when this plant was upplanted or transplanted, it had a little bit of damage to its root ball. It got stunted growth in comparison to the plants around it. Now it's getting outshaded. Now it's not having proper airflow. Now it develops botrytis. And now we have a plant that has now developed a susceptibility that we may not be able to find, and a contamination spreads through a room. There's all kinds of things that can happen. We can have an employee fail to follow proper PPE. We can have HVAC or ventilation or airborne decontamination and filtration go down. There can be a power outage where the lighting system and ventilation system goes down, and now the room spikes to 90 degrees plus, and we have a humidity spike. So now we start developing yeasts, various molds. There's all kinds of things that can happen. A bad batch of cocoa that possibly got left outside at a grow center, got rained on, sweat, wet, and then began to develop a bacteria of its own. Again, we use organic media here. It has the propensity to grow bacteria itself. All of these things can happen. And in a world where a cultivator, again, has to bring that flower to market in order to meet those margins in a very demanding industry, remediation becomes oftentimes the source and solution. And yes, you can move it to extraction. Yes, you can use it for ancillary products. But a lot of times, there's no guarantee that you need that product for that. It may be a flower strain that you really needed to put on your shelf as flower. You may have already allotted your whatever consignment was for what you needed for extraction, what you needed for edibles production. You may not need 1,000 vape pens of strain X when you already have some in inventory. There's a myriad of reasons why you might not be able to push that product to another category, and you have to bring it back as flower.
So moving on to curing, can you explain, I guess we'll just start with your system, what it does, and I mean, what is curing?
So curing is an industry term. Curing means biosynthesis. And biosynthesis is a really cool chemical process that allows for enzymatic reactions to take place. And those enzymatic reactions do all kinds of cool things. So when we look at biosynthesis as it relates to curing and enzymatic reactions as it relates to cannabis, we're looking at controlled chlorophyllic decomposition, as well as the decomposition of starches and glucose. And as chlorophyll, as glucose, as starches break down, there's a lot of byproducts created. Some of these are really cool: cannabinoids, terpenes, flavonoids, and fostering that breakdown as efficiently as possible, controlling that chemical reaction, is curing. Now, how do we cure? There's a huge range. We have curing methodologies from everywhere from turkey bags to 5-gallon buckets to bins to open drying racks to rotating air dryers to whole purpose built rooms to systems like ours. They're all designed to do the same thing: foster biosynthesis. Now, to the degree of which they do that is widely variable. So biosynthesis is, again, based on a couple of factors, and one of them is respiration, gaseous exchange. So one of the cool things that happens with plants, even after they're harvested, is they're still going through a ton of chemical processes. Until we hit true moisture zero, water being the fuel for all carbon-based life on this planet, we are still very much alive. Everything is still very much alive. We're doing things, man. So
Oh my God.
I'm not.
That sounds so crazy.
It's true though. So
Yeah,
one of the things that plants are still doing is they're still breathing, they're still respirating, gaseous exchange is still happening, water is still moving, enzymes are still reacting. We are still very much creating at that time. By no means is harvest the end of life. It's just the next stage. Curation is the control of this stage. We're controlling that biosynthesis reaction. We're curating it. And we're curating it to a point where it is most pleasing from a taste, an aroma, and usability perspective. And there's a long road we go down while we do that. If we think about the valuable parts of cannabis, if we think about cannabinoids, if we think about terpenes and flavonoids, and we understand that they occur throughout the totality of the plant, we can find traces of them in stalks, stems, roots, seeds, leaves. The totality of the plant, we can find it. We can even extract it from the totality of the plant. It doesn't mean it's efficient, but we can do it. How do we capture all of these things? This is the second part of curing. How do we capture all of these things? Well, we know we have the trichome. But what is the trichome? It's a glandular expression, but there's different types of trichomes and they do different things. In the case of cannabis, that trichome is a holding vessel, and it's a vessel designed to hold just a couple of things. Here we are again with our cannabinoids, our terpenes, our flavonoids. But how do we get one to the other? We know the trichomes occur predominantly on the exterior of female flowers. Okay, perfect. We know that our volatile organic compounds occur through the totality of our plant. How do we get one to the other? If the trichome is a cup and the cup is designed to hold these things, how do we fill the cup? This is the other half of curing. This is where we use water and water activity. So instead of thinking of the plant as a continual solution, one liquid, think of it instead as two, and they're fluids of varying viscosity. You have a water and a resin. The water also occurs to the totality of the plant. So we're using that water, we're using that fuel for biological life, that chemical reaction energy here. As we slowly begin to break down through those enzymatic reactions, the chlorophyll, the starches, the glucose, again, occurring through the totality of the plant, we're creating those acids, we're creating those terpenes, those flavonoids, those cannabinoids. And that water, as we're constricting it, as we're slowly removing that water, we're removing it in such a way where we're pulling it to the exterior of the plant. This is why we see harvest methodologies. We often see, well, there's kind of three huge methodologies here. We have whole plant methodology, which is obviously hanging the whole plant, flower only methodology, which is just the flower. And we have, what's called natural hanger or branch methodology, utilizing small, short, curated pieces. They're all designed to do the same thing, and it can depend on your cultivar, which may be necessary. But again, it all comes down to this water control. Hanging the whole plant, we may have more water than we really need. Because here's the thing, we don't necessarily get to control what we're reacting first. So as we go through this chemical biosynthesis reaction for curing, if we have a lot of stock material, a lot of stem material, we're also going to be using that chemical reaction, that water, our fuel, to break down, again, chlorophyll, glucose, starches, and material that we don't need. We don't need to break it down into a fan leaf. We don't need to break it down into stock. We don't need to improve the flavor and aroma of these compounds. And we don't need to spend the energy pushing the very little yield that we gain from them to our holding vessel, our trichome, which again occurs in the flower. Conversely, now on the other side of the coin, flower-only methodologies, there might not be enough water content in the flower alone to fuel that reaction and then to move that now created compounds, as created molecular compounds, to our holding vessel and trichome. So, which is why typically what we see in the industry at this point is the branch methodology, which is a cut branch of cannabis with semi-curated flowers on it, a lot of the fan leaf, water leaf removed, easy sun leaf, anything that doesn't damage the flower, and utilizing the water in the flower, the water in the stem for that, and then utilizing the atmosphere in the room that they're in through that drying process to finish or facilitate those final few degrees of variance. Now, with all of that said, all of these methodologies do it. Again, buckets, bins, bags, whole rooms in our system. The difference comes in how efficient is it? When you start looking at something like a bucket system, which is a limited environment system, what you're doing with that is you're using the limited environment inside that bucket, the small amount of air, to control the degree of the chemical reaction. Knowing that that plant has to respirate, that gaseous exchange has to happen as part of this. If we limit the amount of air that plant can breathe, once it doesn't have anything to breathe, it'll stop breathing. We can kickstart that breathing again by burping the bucket, opening it, introducing new atmosphere. And it's not, it's a horribly inefficient process for multiple reasons. It's not a bad process by any means. It can be used to great effect. I have seen some amazingly cured cannabis come out of bucket and burp systems. It's incredibly labor intensive. It has a high propensity to destroy flower. It's incredibly susceptible to variance. And it is almost purely subjective because you're relying on someone's nose. Now, from the sense of a cannabis sommelier, there's something incredibly appealing on that when you kind of think about that, that someone is curating your cannabis. But at the same time, that person's probably not trained in any way, shape, or form to identify what they're smelling. They're just going on, does this one smell like the last one or close enough? Now, in that bucket system, if you put 1,000 grams in the bucket versus 900 grams, you're going to have a different result. You're going to have a different degree of reaction. All kinds of things are going to change. There's very little repeatability, very little consistency. And when you think about consistency, especially from a medical product, it gets very apparent how important it is real fast. I use the aspirin methodology. If you take an aspirin and it takes your headache away, and you take another aspirin and it makes your foot go numb, this is a huge problem. So when you look at consistency in cannabis and we look at terpene development, look at cannabinoid development, knowing that these are two molecular compounds that have a notable effect on the user experience, delivering a consistent degree and ratio of those becomes paramount. So bucket systems, bin systems, these have in large kind of gone out the way in some cases. They're still used in others. Again, it's kind of, this is one of those really art versus science questions of when do we really move this from subjective to objective? And the answer is through analytical testing. The problem being is that very few companies have in-house analytical capabilities, and testing is incredibly expensive. So instead of testing across the lifespan of a curation environment, oftentimes we just test at the very end. Now, if that product doesn't have the exact same definable chemical standards, so what? It still goes on the shelf. One of the things that we really wanted to design with our system was a means to deliver that function consistently. And it's not that Mother Nature doesn't do this herself, and it's not that any of these technologies don't. It's again about that time and consistency. So one of the things that we thought about as we were looking at it was that we'd already had, again, the clean cannabis base to start from, we already had a perfectly sealed hermetic chamber that we were able to control to an nth degree, both in terms of atmospheric composition as well as environmental factors, temperature and humidity. Then again, contemplating that, okay, if these are the factors that control biosynthesis with cannabis, let's see what we can do. So then we really began looking at what are ideal curation variables for cannabis. How can we foster that biosynthesis chemical reaction as quickly as possible? Where do we best fit into that chain across that production spectrum? Is it at principal drying? Is it after principal drying? Is it before X moisture content? Where do we need to sit from an active water perspective? Kind of really looking at all of these things. And what we found is if we're able to interact with the product after it has completed its principal dry, after it's declinated down to that final moisture content where you separate all of the final leaves, all of the stems, and we kind of really now utilize that last bit of moisture, again, no longer to break anything down, but just to move those resins to our holding vessel. Is that where we excel? And we found that from that point, all the way up through principal, all the way up to principal dry, that we can interact and speed that equation. So how much could we speed it became a question. If we look at 30 days in a bucket or bin system, we can accomplish that in about 7 days analytically. But the question becomes, where do you want to leave off cannabis? Not every cultivar is going to be the same. Not everyone is going to have the same propensities, the same requirements from a development standpoint. What if it only needs 3 days, 5 days, 7 days? How do we begin to really look at what's the idealistic end point for cannabis? And that's where we really kind of started to look at all of the different flavor, aroma aspects, and start really discussing with other cultivators of what is an idealistically cured product and how can we potentially deliver something that allows you to get from A to B regardless of what road. And what we landed on was a system that allowed us to control to an nth degree temperature, humidity, atmospheric composition. And we found that making it in the same size and building it into our decontamination system, again, twofold. One, a clean place to start. But when we started looking at controlling these elements of atmosphere, what became very apparent very quickly is we wanted as small a space as possible. Every cubic inch of space that we were not using, we still had to develop and manipulate. And knowing that we had to manipulate it to such a specific degree, having to deal with whole rooms, volumetric equations that are in yards or meters instead of inches and centimeters became incredibly cost prohibitive very, very quickly. Now we're no longer talking about a tool that we can deliver to a client. Now we're talking about a renovation to a building, and that's far less feasible.
So if for somebody to use your equipment, they would put it in a room where they've already dried it, or they've come to a certain process and they're curing, and or
So you can put it anywhere you want. It looks about the size of an older refrigerator. It's about 5.5 feet tall, 2.5 feet wide, about 3 feet, about 3 feet deep. So it looks about the size of an old refrigerator, passes through any standard door frame, runs on a 110 outlet. Knowing that we come from a cultivations background, having worked so closely with cultivators, most of whom are our friends, compatriots, and spirited competitors, that
love that.
every square foot of space in a cultivation is used 2, if not 3 times over. It just is. So the idea of having something that couldn't fit through a door frame, something that couldn't be moved wherever you needed it to be moved, something that couldn't exist completely on its own, and something that I didn't have to care about what circuit it got plugged into was absolutely paramount.
Yeah.
So it's a fairly space efficient tool, but it's got a lot of power to it. Again, it processes about 30 pounds at a time. We got clients that get even more into it. And when you start looking at it, and you really want to start curating things, and while it's possible to decontaminate multiple strains at once, multiple cultivars at the same time, even if they don't have similar contamination profiles, you can still do it. When you start looking at curating cannabis, you really want to pay attention to those uniquities. That matter of 12 hours, that matter of 24 hours when you're running that chemical equation at its maximum efficacy, that's a lot of development. You may easily push past the ideal threshold for strain A because you were waiting on strain B. And that's kind of really where those two things differentiate, is that we can clean all cannabis unilaterally, we can clean all cannabis tactically, but it is nigh on impossible to cure all cannabis unilaterally. You pretty much have to cure cannabis tactically. You have to pay attention to those cultivar uniquities because they do, and that's what you're looking for here. Just like you wouldn't treat all wine the same or all whiskey the same. Those unique prophenols, those terpene profiles, those unique flavonoids, its unique cannabinoid content. These are all things that you want to highlight, not necessarily pave over with a unilateral brush.
But once we narrow it down and we perfect it and refine it, this is what you're talking about. People are going to come to expect this.
Well, and we've even seen a development in consumer demand. If you kind of look at what was in demand 3, 4, 5 years ago, we're looking at consumers and patients who are buying strictly based on potency, strictly based on, in effect, like I want the highest THC available flower. I want the highest, THC available hash or what have you. Terpene profile, terpene content really wasn't in the consumer lexicon up until about 2-ish years ago.
Yeah.
And now it's one of the key industry buzzwords. It's up there with synergy.
Yeah.
It's important to think of because it's such an important part of the user experience in the medicinal compound. And one of the ways I encourage people to think of it, and kind of the analogy that I use is the car and the destination. If we think of the cannabinoid as the vehicle, and we think of the potency as the velocity, the speed of that vehicle, the destination is the terpene profile. That's what's triggering that specific neurosynaptic response. If we look at cannabis compounds that are high in linalool and terpinolene, these are compounds that have the couch lock moniker that this is going to be very sedative. Or then we look at the other end of the spectrum, we look at things that are high in alpha pinene or limonene. These are our racy sativas. These are our active strains. We can take a shot in the middle at humulene and myrcene, our relaxation, our euphoria. And what combination of those, what ratio of those is kind of really what directs a lot of that end user experience. So I'm really happy to see that we're seeing the consumer now ask for these things, because when the consumer asks for them, the cultivator, the producer has to be more forward to them. And that's what's going to spurn curation practices of consistency. That's what's really going to push these cultivators, these operators to develop these unique expressions of strains. And how we do that is going to be through analytical testing and simple science. And these are two things I truly love.
Yeah, no, you're right, because in the end, when we're going to really be, products are really going to be competing, it's all going to be based on the user experience, which has to do with the combinations of all these, the entourage effect of all the things that we're talking about. So we're going to be judged.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And especially again, if we look at it from a medicinal standpoint, from a nutraceutical standpoint or individualized medicine, this is something that has even more bearing in the conversation.
Yes, yes. Oh my God, yes. I mean, absolutely. That's what even more so, we've got to be able to pinpoint this and manipulate it, because cannabis medicine has to be consistent, but also it's based on specific cannabinoid profiles, combinations, and all that stuff. That's what doctors who are doing this research are finding, the specific, like what unlocks this specific receptor, it's, and then the cultivators or the genetics people have to create that seed, and then they have to grow it properly, and then they have to manipulate it in curing properly.
Well, and thankfully, one of the things that we do have going for us is that our breeding programs, our breeders in the industry are incredibly familiar with chemotype manipulation, looking at a plant for its chemical compound value and production. They've looked at it extensively from a cannabinoid production standpoint, but it's those same methodologies, those same practices they are already in place of, that they are already utilizing, that will be used for flavonoid and terpene development as well. There simply just hasn't been quite the call for it yet. The first thing we took a deep dive into was cannabinoids. It's the thing we understood, at least at that time, the most, or we thought we understood the most.
Right.
When we look at how we understand terpenes, most US tests max out at between 12 and 24 terpene compounds. I've seen some that go significantly north. I think the best test I've still seen to this date was out of Israel. It was a little over 400, I think it was 461 terpene compounds that they were potentially able to identify. But one of the crazy things here is that there's terpene compounds, just like there's cannabinoid compounds, that are so rare that they're only ever seen in nanogram or microgram amounts. And with terpenes being incredibly volatile free radical hydrocarbons, some of them are so fragile that they start to disseminate, atomize, and oxidize within seconds. And
So,
so we have we have now methodologies like live resin, live rosin that are attempts to capture as many of these terpenes, as many of these cannabinoids that have these high degrees of volatility, these high degrees of oxidization as quickly as possible. We have extraction methodologies now that are kind of veering away from the damaging aspects. When we look at CO2 systems, supercritical and subcritical CO2 systems, incredibly destructive to terpene compounds. I mean, what comes out the other side after, some type of chromatography, be it falling film, white film, thin film, whatever it may be, is THC soup. It's lost any identifiable characteristic. Distillate, while having a ton of uses, at least in my personal opinion, not really enjoyable to consume by itself. Doesn't really do anything.
but I'd love to talk about aging cannabis and vintage strains.
Yes.
I read an article. I guess that you were talking about this a couple years ago, and I thought it seemed so interesting. And I guess that kind of falls into the whole curing process too, right? The
It
aging.
does.
So
It
what
does. So
does
as these terpene compounds develop, we're not going to gain more through curation. We're going to gain more in that first, we're going to gain everything we have in that first part of biosynthesis, that first phase where we have that respiration, we have those enzymatic reactions, we're breaking down those compounds, we're creating our volatile organic compounds and our acids. That's when we have everything. But that doesn't mean that's where we want it to be. Think of a soundboard or a studio mixer. We can push all the dials all the way up. It may be the most atrocious sound ever. But as some of those notes begin to dial down, as we begin to find where they fall on a specific spectrum, we get beautiful, beautiful music. Terpene development is the exact same thing. There's going to be points where we have pleasant, pleasing aromas, flavors. And they're going to be different for each cultivar. And I've seen that one cultivar have multiple different pleasing strains. There was a cherry lime haze that I cultivated as part of a team years and years ago. Incredibly fickle strain, wanted to go a little bit longer than most of the stuff that we had cultivating at the time, which was running on a 9-week turn. It really wanted to go 10 and a half, 11, and it was kind of always just a pain. But through the first probably about 20 or so days of its post-harvest life, it had no real discernible nose. And then from about day 25 through day 45, it developed a beautiful kind of bright, almost carbonated lemon lime aroma. And then if you let it go farther than that, it would completely drop off. It would go almost to a muddled wood. And then you could bring it back around day 73, 75. It's like this rich, dark cherry, as like the terpene profiles just naturally took those balances.
and how do you know what's happening? Like that they're doing this?
I,
Is the
I was given a horrifically giant research budget and very little oversight.
in general, like how do you see, like when you're doing it, how do you go, oh, okay, we need to tone it down? Whatever you do, when you manipulate the I guess
So,
the
so
acts.
at that point when I was playing with it that way, like, the only thing that I could do was understand that the only variable I could control effectively was the oxidization rate. So what I was in search of was, I was out hunting a mythical creature. I'm hunting for a unicorn, I guess. That at some point in time across this bell curve, there's going to be places I want to stop. I don't know where they are, but I know how to keep the curve consistent. So let's go ahead and track at just gradient across the curve, as many as we can put in reasonably, and let's see where we are here. Let's check objectively, let's check subjectively. What's it smell like? It doesn't smell good. All right, test it anyway. What's it smell like? It smell, and then seeing where those rising points, seeing where those fall off points were, and then knowing that, okay, I now know the environmental variables. I now know the rate of time and the rate of decay and atomization of these terpenes, that I can get back to spot Z by doing this. So now I can develop this consistently. But to find them, it's a treasure hunt.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So you did research on this, like a project that where you
I,
did?
I did at one of the companies I was managing at the time. I was uh, doing all of their post-harvest. I was actually doing multiple departments at that time for them, but one of the departments was their post-harvest department. And again, awesome research budget, incredibly little oversight. They gave me a giant warehouse and said pretty much everything under this roof is you. I'm like, ooh.
That must have been fun.
No, it absolutely was. It's to this day the greatest team I've ever had the privilege to work with.
Wow. So, okay. So, do you see vintage weed as something that'll be sold in the future, like on the shelves, where it's like, this is vintage weed from, Northern California, and it's 3 years old, or, is it?
No, no, I've thought about this a lot, kind of the sense of like, you look at heirloom vegetables, will we see heirloom weed, will we see heirloom cultivars? I think we will. There's kind of been various points where I've seen them pop up. I've seen some old Afghan hazes pop up. I've seen some widows pop up. I've some of those, Acapulco Gold, some of those classic strains that, have a place in the hearts and minds of cannabis consumers and enthusiasts for many decades now.
Yeah.
I've I've seen them pop up. Are they what they claim to be? I don't know. Are they a variant down the pathway? Are they a phenotype of? Are they six generations gone from it? Maybe, possibly. Strain hunters is a popular group. That they travel the world. They really do look for those kind of OG strains, those origin strains. They absolutely exist. They're out there. There's some Hindu Kush variant somewhere that I would absolutely love to get my hand on, that's been cultivated by monks for 5,000 years, or at least so I assume. That's what I tell myself. But there's got to be things like that are out there like that. We know they are. We found a few of them. Do I see those as kind of being traded, those as being brought to market? Yeah, for their uniquity. But in reality, all the work we've done to cannabis through breeding, through chemotype development, through just general tissue culture and structuring, genetic identification of expression, has been to the benefit of us and to the consumer. And while it's nice to take that retrospective look back, where it's nice to see where we've came from, in reality, we've purpose built what we have now. Known strains being played with differently, a unique twist on a blue dream, someone who finds a different curation pattern, a different terpene expression. Do I see a classic strain being re-envisioned or kind of redeveloped? Yeah, I think there is a possibility for that. And I think as we see a lot of that kind of development through breeding, one of the things we come back to is, where are our stable strains? What are our strains that we've kind of not perfected, but that we really kind of have now as our base ingredients, our breeder strains, our Durban poisons, our golden goats, kind of some of those classic strains, that Gorilla Glue #4. Can we go back? Can we look at that? Was there something we missed there? Now that we know what we know now, having that stable, having that in the archive, can we apply our new learning to that old and bring that old into an even newer, grander light? Yeah, I think there's some really cool things to happen there.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, breeding's going to be interesting. I'm sure AI is going to have a big say in that too, as far as
It's had
figuring.
a say in everything else. I mean, it's got
Yeah,
to.
and it's yeah.
Well,
But as far as like, I guess when I mean vintage too, like aging, will it be a thing that if you say you took it past, like what you were talking earlier, took it past its point, and now it started transforming into something else. It's like, this is like 2 years old, but
so I think what you'll see is kind of that preservation, almost like you preserve a cigar, almost like kind of that humidor. Once you've hit an active water content, a stabilization where we no longer have the propensity for microbial growth, we're not going to really foster any more chemical reaction. We're not moving any resins. Now we're just preserving this. I think that you'll see that kind of really come forward. And I think the path to that is, again, people playing with that curation, playing, all those points on the bell curve, finding different ways to manipulate that curve. One of the things I've always loved is how much of a puzzle cannabis truly is, both understanding it, cultivating, developing it, and then realizing that there's still more to go. There's still that sight unseen. It's been one of the coolest projects I've ever gotten to play with.
So I guess the last question that I have is the data that you're talking about that the industry really needs. How do we get, like, what kind of data are you talking about, like,
But
specifically?
from from microbial standpoint, the data that I'm talking about is we need to look at microbial contamination of all of our surfaces, all of our constituent parts, pieces, and grow media. We need to understand what the propensity is in our living plants for microbial threshold and bioburden. We need to understand what susceptibilities we might have to guard against there. We need to understand the impacts of our drying and how we see accelerated microbial growth when we think about plants and microbes as a host parasite for that parasite, for that microbe. That drying is when it sees life coming to its end. It replicates fast. We need to understand what our degree of bioburden increase and changes between these 2 points. And then we need to understand how can we effectively remediate to the best of our ability to total sanitization without destroying any type of volatile organic compound or leaving any trace chemicals behind or disrupting the plant itself through radiation or whatever. And then from a curation and terpene standpoint, what we need to understand is where are we for our development of our cannabinoids across the exact same methods and timeframes as we're taking those tests for our microbes. We need to understand what are we developing in week 3 of flower? What are we developing in week 5, 7, 9? What are we seeing from that development from the root cannabinoid to our variant cannabinoids and valent cannabinoids? And then how are we seeing that change? Are we seeing acetic changes? Are we seeing enzymatic changes? Are we seeing that compound development consistently through our drying practices? Are we utilizing the totality of our water properly? Are we achieving an appropriate active water content that allows us to maintain our microbial stability while still having enough to go ahead and have our resinous water transfer, have our development, and then how are we seeing the fall off of the preservation of that? Where are we seeing this from a shelf life perspective for a user? Because if cannabis is sitting on a shelf and it was clean when it went on a shelf and it was 25% potency when it was on a shelf and it was 3% terpene content when it went on a shelf, is it still that 90 days later in a jar? No, I almost assure you it is not. So where do we see that from a shelf stability? How do we deliver that consistency to consumer? And it's through analytical testing. It's through replicate analytical testing.
Yeah, I've overheard a bunch of different conversations with extractors talking about the same thing, like sharing each, information, so each of them, so there's a standard
Yep.
of, a baseline of different things. Maybe I'm not extracting.
Yep. No, exactly right. And instead of having this burden of each individual comparator, each individual operator going at this en masse ad infinitum and with the entire gamut of their strain cultivation or product offering library, and it doesn't have to be that onerous on an operator. If we can come together as an industry, as a community, from an academic perspective, these are things that we can do that will benefit all of us as well as our profits and industry itself. Um, it it sounds easy. It sounds obvious.
It doesn't sound easy.
I just well, that's
It's obvious.
it does in my utopia.
So okay, definitely last question. So how would that be accomplished? Is it something that somebody, I mean, would each cultivator, each extractor, they'd all have to be doing their analytics and then uploading it, so everybody, how would that work?
There's been a couple of databases that have tried it in the past. Those Bioscience tried it. They kind of fell off. There was some notable issues with some of the things they were doing there. There's been other organizations that have tried to map the cannabis genome. There has been organizations that have tried to really show definitively what a chemotype profile of a given strain is in order to define it so we can really start those things. It's a great question. And it really comes to a source of what are we willing to share? What do we decide is common data and what do we decide is proprietary IP? As it stands, with the industry being as competitive as it is, that's a really big ask.
Yeah, yeah.
So
Maybe,
I think the first thing we need is a federal legalization that allows this platform, because that's something we don't have. And until we see the dissolution of these microcosms, because as it stands right now, a cultivator in Oklahoma doesn't probably really care what a cultivator in Massachusetts is doing with what may be the same cut, because it doesn't apply to them and their unique regulations. So until we have a level
yeah,
playing field, there's not a lot we can do. So where does it start? It starts with a level playing field. It starts with a federal legalization.
yeah. Perfect ending.